all heard the saying that if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is. Perhaps more than any other type of criminal, the confidence man, or con man as they're better known, grabs our attention. Maybe it's because they use intelligence as opposed to force, or because their victims are oftentimes caught up in their own greed that we tend to give them more of a pass. After all, we would never be as naive as to give our banking information to a Nigerian prince or buy a plane ticket for that supermodel we met online. But people do fall for scams. And George C. Parker, Victor Lustig, and Gregor MacGregor would find people willing to hand over money for schemes that were just too good to be true. And you'll want to stick around to the end because the best comes at the end. Welcome to History is Criminal. I'm your host, Mick Biddick, and in today's episode, we're going to take a look at three of the most famous con men in history. While we sometimes admire the con men, make no mistake, they are thieves. On occasion, they take advantage of people's greed, but they are just as likely to prey on the naive, the innocent, those who, for whatever reason, just don't seem to know better. And if you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you. This old saying points out when we're being gullible. It can also be a harmless way to tell somebody that they need to rethink what they believe to be true. But what few people realize is that phrase can be traced to one man, George C. Parker. Now, believe it or not, many people have sold the Brooklyn Bridge to unwitting rubes. But Parker claims to have been able to sell the bridge at least twice a week. Now, we only have the word of a con man to go on here, but we know he did sell it more than once. He also sold Madison Square Garden, the Statue of Liberty, Grant's Tomb, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and numerous lots owned by the city of New York. Now, New York in the late 1800s was being flooded with daily newcomers, immigrants just off the boat, hicks who come to the big city to make a living, and these would be Parker's prey. The scam seems like it wouldn't work. After all, these were well known landmarks. How could they be for sale? First problem is he'd have to spend enough time with his marks to convince them that he did, in fact, own the famous landmark. The next step was to explain how they could make a good living if they owned it. With the bridge, it was tolls. He would assure the mark that by setting up a toll booth on the bridge, they would make their money back in no time, and after that, the profit would just roll in. Now, it's important to understand that it wasn't uncommon for an individual to own a bridge, even a major transportation link in the 1800s. It was well known that for years, the only rail bridge in and out of the city of New York was owned by Cornelius Vanderbilt, a fact that ended up giving him control of over 40% of U.S. rail traffic. So, a man owning the Brooklyn Bridge was not unheard of. And these marks must have felt like they had found the golden ticket when Parker was willing to let the bridge go at a bargain price. It was only when they set up a toll booth on the bridge and the police showed up that they realized they had been scammed. Now, I can feel for the victims here, but at the same time, what was going on in their heads? How Parker was able to get his victims to believe what he was selling boggles the mind. But Parker was good and always found an angle to work. Now, he would find himself in jail on more than one occasion. In 1908, he was able to simply walk out of jail. After being arrested, he was able to use his slick people skills to quickly become a trustee in the jail in just weeks. It would normally take years to get in a position being a trustee, but he managed to do this in just weeks. And when the sheriff showed up to inspect the jail and give a talk, he left his jacket and hat sitting on a chair. So Parker just simply put on the coat and hat and walked out the door of the jail. Not a single person asked a question. Present yourself with enough confidence, stand tall, and just walk like you own it. His cons were both huge, taking as much as $50,000 or 800,000 in today's money to as little as $50. But it would be a check for $150 that would bring him down. In 1928, he was passing bad checks like a cowboy in a Mel Brooks movie. It would be his fourth felony conviction, which carried a mandatory life sentence. And Parker would die in Sing Sing prison in 1937. Now, before we get too drawn into the stereotype of the New York huckster selling off famous landmarks to folks with questionable logic, let me introduce you to Victor Lustig, aka the Count. An American Secret Service agent would call him the smoothest con man that ever lived. Born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1890, he was able to master several languages and develop a calm, slick demeanor that would fit his chosen profession perfectly. His marks were typically the wealthy and greedy, and often criminals themselves. Among his more famous marks was Al Capone. Reportedly, he was so smooth in scamming the mob boss that he never knew that Lustig had ripped him off. Basically, what this con employed was he convinced Al Capone to loan him $50,000 on some scheme he had going. It took a little bit, but he convinced Capone to loan him the money. Then he just simply took the money and set it aside for several weeks. Came back to Capone and said, "Look, the scheme fell through, but I'm going to give you back your money." Capone was so impressed by his honesty and his willingness to pay him back so promptly that he gave him Lustig said it was never really about the money with Capone. It was just so he could get in on his good side, which he in fact did. Before the First World War began, he decided to make a buck or two while seeing the world. So, still in his 20s, he took to the high seas. He targeted ocean liners making the cross between Europe and New York. The ship's first class passengers would load it with more money than they knew what to do with. And like many of the uber rich, they were always looking for a way to find more money. On board ship, the Count, as he was going by, would befriend his marks. Like most conmen, he was skilled at judging people, knowing which ones would be open to a plan to make some easy money. Now, he would, of course, have multiple scams he could use. One was selling shares to a non existent Broadway play, kind of like the producers, but with no springtime for Hitler. And unlike on the producers, he got away with it. But his go to scam was the money box. He played this con in Europe and the US, but was on board ship where he perfected it. Engaging his marks in small talk, the topic would eventually turn to how did the Count gain his vast wealth? That's when he'd tell them of the money box. It was a combination of sleight of hand, overwhelming bravado, and a victim who wanted something the easy way. He would show his marks a real $100 bill, placing the bill in the box. He would add a few chemicals, then allow it to sit for a while, and then he would produce from the box two crisp, brand new $100 bills. The bills were easily passed aboard ship, and now the Mark wanted to know how they could get a box for their own. At first, of course, he'd refuse to sell the box, but his Mark would continue to pressure him. Oftentimes, he would even have multiple Marks bidding for the box. This was part of his skill. He was able to convince his victims that he really didn't want to part with the device. This act only made his Marks want the box even more. He would typically wait until the last day of the cruise, and he would finally agree to part with the box, usually at about $10,000 richer. He also would make sure that he packed the box with enough $100 bills that by the time they realized the box was a sham, he was long gone. With the onset of World War I, it put a stop to the ocean liner cons. He was able to duplicate the money box an amazing number of times, even later confessing to a U.S. Marshal that he once sold the box to a group of New York gamblers for $47,000 or roughly 750 in today's world. But what the Count is best known for is selling the Eiffel Tower. Hard for us today to think that the famous Paris landmark was once a costly eyesore that many Parisians wanted torn down. Built in 1889 as part of the Paris expedition, it was meant to stand for only a short time, then be disassembled and the metal put to use in some other project. In 1925, Lustig was intrigued by an article he read. The tower, already decades past its life expectancy, had become a rusty mess. Debate raged on just what should be done with it. As it would turn out, Lustig, the Count, knew just what to do. He started by researching major scrap metal dealers in France. Once he had his list, he forged a letterhead identifying him as the deputy director of the Ministry des Postes et Telegraphes. In his introduction letter, he would tell his marks that there was the possibility of a very lucrative deal. He also said that the deal would have to be done with the utmost secrecy. He entertained a number of scrap metal dealers, using a room in one of the nicest hotels in Paris, renting limousines, and even giving tours of the tower. He was able to present the idea that the city was going to start taking bids for the tower's demolition and the 7,000 tons of scrap metal that would be produced. The project would be worth millions to the company that won the bid, but the Count focused on one mark, Andre Poisson. He convinced Poisson that he was just a hardworking civil servant who didn't have a great deal of money, but he had been entrusted to find the right company to take care of the tower. Poisson, for his part, knew how Parisian government worked, and if he had to grease the right palm to get things done, he would do it. So he gave the Count $70,000, about 1.4 million in today's market, to ensure he got the winning bid. Money in hand, Lustig fled to Austria, waiting for the story to break, but it never did. It seemed Poisson was worried about the embarrassment of falling for the scam, so he never reported Lustig. So it was back across the Atlantic once again to the U.S. Lustig was selling money boxes all across the U.S., using dozens of aliases. He was picked up 40 times, but either was able to ensure the authorities that he was innocent or he simply escaped from jail. He even scammed a sheriff in Texas out of a fortune in tax funds. When the sheriff tracked him down, he was able to convince the sheriff that it was his own fault, that he didn't understand how the money box worked. And once again, he was able to walk away. By the 1930s, he had moved on to actual, factual, for real counterfeiting. He was doing very well at it too, reportedly passing $100,000 a month. This is what brought him to the attention of the Secret Service. They tracked him for months before finally capturing him in May 1935. He put up no fight, and a search turned up a key to a subway station locker. In the locker, they found more than enough evidence to send him to trial. As he sat waiting in jail for the trial, he joked with the guards that the jail couldn't hold him. They laughed. After all, he was a smooth talker, but this jail, they assured him, was escape-proof. Then, the morning of his trial, they came, opened up his cell, and found it was empty. It was the old rope from a bedsheet trick, a la Jack Shepherd from episode number 3. In broad daylight, dressed in his prison blues, he climbed out of the cell, pretended to be a window washer on his way down to the street. Dozens of people passed, but no one paid the slightest bit of attention. Once again, just act like you belong, don't be in a hurry, and don't raise a fuss. He was picked up again 1 month later in Pittsburgh. He pled guilty to the original charge and was sentenced to 20 years and sent to Alcatraz. By 1949, he was in the medical center for federal prisoners in Missouri. He died that May from pneumonia. On his death certificate, his occupation was listed as salesman. He had pulled scams across the oceans and across continents. But Gregor MacGregor would go even bigger. His scam would sell an entire country. Imagine Indiana Jones mixed with P.T. Barnum and then throw in a dash of Baron Munchausen, and you get Gregor MacGregor, Scottish-born son of a sea captain, a member of the clan Gregor, and the great-great-nephew of the Jacobite outlaw and hero, Rob Roy. Though the details are sketchy, he might have spent some time at Edinburgh University, but failed to complete a degree. At 16, his family purchased a commission for him in the British Army. Now, that was a somewhat regular thing at the time. You could simply buy a military rank. Um, and then from there, I guess you better prove it was worth it. He entered the military as an ensign, but quickly got promoted on merit to the rank of lieutenant. Then, in 1804, he married Maria Bowater, whose wealthy family had important connections. Now, this was the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and MacGregor would see action. He was able to purchase the rank of captain for about 950 pounds, then once again was able to rank up on merit to major. He served under the Duke of Wellington. A conflict with a higher ranking officer forced him to give up his commission and return to Britain in May 1810. The 23-year-old lived in a home rented by his mother and tried to make inroads into Scottish high society, but failed. So it was off to London, where he found far more luck convincing members of the aristocracy that he was one of them. He falsely claimed to be heir to the chiefdom of the clan Gregor. While this brought no money, it did give him the air of respectability he was looking for. When Maria died in December of 1811, he lost his primary source of income, the support of the wealthy Bowater family. MacGregor was at a loss of what to do next. His less than glorified exit from the military made a return to the army unlikely. He had burned some bridges in Scotland, and it was far too soon to go out and find another rich bride. But exciting news was coming from the New World. Spanish colonies were in full revolt, and it seemed that a person can make a name for themselves in this new era. So he sold his small farm in Scotland and sailed for South America in 1812. He fought in that country's War of Independence, serving under the famed revolutionary Simon Bolivar. His record of command is mixed, but he did lead a series of campaigns in the Caribbean, including in 1817 when he captured a group of islands off the coast of Florida from Spain. It's said that he did have a tendency to desert his men if it looked like certain defeat, but he was so charming that he was actually able to marry Bolivar's sister. More impressive, he was able to get a local native leader to grant him 8 million acres of land on Central America's Mosquito Coast, near present-day Honduras. It's not really clear if he had any real claim to this land, but that wouldn't slow him down. The land itself was an undeveloped tract of jungle. That would soon change, at least in MacGregor's view. Returning to London in 1821, MacGregor had an amazing story to tell. He told of the land of Poya, a beautiful, prosperous land. Poya is a true Eden, land so fertile that anything you want will grow in abundance. It produces 3 harvests a year of Indian corn, and each harvest produces 100 bushels per acre. Now, to give you an idea, at the end of the century, American farmers were only getting 26 bushels per acre. So this was fabulously fertile land. He said the water is so pure that it will quench any thirst, and that the riverbeds are lined with gold. The natives, the Poyers, were beautiful people, peaceful and kind, who welcomed new arrivals. And as luck would have it, they had named him their cazique, or prince. He had come to Europe to find good, honest, hardworking people to emigrate to Poya at the bargain price of 3 shillings an acre. At that price, the average worker making £3 a week could purchase dozens of acres with just a few weeks' savings. He quickly set up a foreign office in London, printing flyers, gave interviews to newspapers. MacGregor and his wife became major players in the societal scene of London. The Lord Mayor gave a banquet in their honor. Aristocrats allowed them to live in their country homes outside the city. He showed off maps of his nation's borders, a letter from the Mosquito King supporting his Kazakh ship. He had a national flag, banknotes from Apoya National Bank, all types of official-looking documents. He even entertained the upper crust of society with tales of his military exploits, overly exaggerated, fighting the Spanish and the wars of Latin American independence, and they ate it up. Now, this scam seems impossible today. I mean, at best, a scam like this might get you elected to public office. Probably not able to sell an entire fake country. But in 1820s, news didn't travel fast. Latin America was known to be volatile politically, so a new country coming into existence was not impossible. And of course, with the concept of European superiority, it would make perfect sense that the lowly natives would ask a heroic European to lead them. Farmers came first. They sold their land, broke their leases, and rushed to buy acreage in Poya. Then he went one step further. He printed massive stacks of Poyan dollars and had the farmers exchange their English pounds for the local currency. This would allow them to be able to make purchases as soon as they got off the boat. But the farmers were not his only marks. He had soon floated 200,000 pounds worth of bonds for Poya on the English market. Then he started to sell titles and commissions in the Poyan military. With Poya clearly being a cash cow, bankers wanted in on the act, and His Royal Highness Gregor MacGregor was more than willing to let them come on board. The money rolled in like the wind sweeping across the Poyan plains, if such a place existed. But like all great scams, this one would have to come to an end in September 1822. Japanese settlers boarded a ship called the Honduras Packet and set sail for the golden shores of the Poyan capital of St. Joseph, where the Black River meets the sea. Be hard to imagine what was going through the minds of those poor suckers when the ship reached the shore of the coastline. At first, they must have thought the navigation was off and that the capital lay just nearby, but they searched and searched and searched, only to find more and more undeveloped jungle. Before the news was able to reach England that there was no St. Joseph on the Mosquito Coast, a second ship set sail, loaded with 180 settlers, stacked with farming equipment and seed. They sailed on a ship known as Kinnersley Castle, flying the Poyan flag, white with a green cross of St. George. They too arrived to find nothing, no settlement, no roads, no farmland, just beach and jungle. The second group also explored, and they found the original 70 settlers living in tents and makeshift huts. It was only then that they knew they had been conned. Word spread quickly along the Mosquito Coast of the 250 or so English who were now camping in the jungle and contracting malaria. It was then that George Frederick Augustus I came to the camp. George, it seems, was the king that supposedly granted MacGregor the 8 million acres. And George was none too happy about his unwanted guest or this BS country of Poya. He was thinking about killing all the settlers, unless, of course, they pledged their loyalty to him. Meanwhile, 6 more ships are getting ready to leave England. News managed to travel to the actual British colony in Belize, and boats were dispatched, and the surviving colonists taken to Belize. 180 of the original 250 died from malaria and yellow fever. The British Navy was able to turn back 5 of the 6 ships sailing to Poya. Fortunately, the 6th ship stopped in Belize instead of sailing directly to Poya. By the time it was done, only 50 of the original settlers ever made it back to Britain. When the news reached the British Isles, MacGregor ran like a cat smothered in gravy turned loose in a dog pound. But he wasn't done. He started the exact scam again in France, this time duping the French farmers into buying chunks of Poya. I know this guy's evil, but you have to admire the sheer chutzpah of pulling this scam a second time across the channel. He wasn't as lucky this time, however, and he found himself on trial. But, and this is crazy, he was acquitted. Then, just to prove that no one, and I mean no one, has the brass balls as big as the Scots, he returned to Britain and started selling over 800,000 pounds of bonds for Poya. He was able to keep this up until he finally retired to Venezuela, where, don't forget, he was an actual war hero in the mid-1830s. By the time he was done, he had taken over 1.3 million pounds from his marks. That is roughly 3.6 billion today, or 4.7 billion US dollars. He died quietly on his estate in Venezuela in 1845 at 58 years old. Love him or hate him, the great conman will always capture our imagination, if for no other reason than to just ask, how the hell did they get away with it? And would I be smart enough not to get caught up in this scam? Sources used for this episode include Meet the Conman That Sold the Brooklyn Bridge Many Times Over on history.howstuffworks.com, The Smoothest Conman That Ever Lived on smithsonianmag.com, The Conman Who Invented His Own Country on history.com, and Diabolical, How a Conman Pulled the Evilest Agriculture Fraud in History on ag.com. This has been History is Criminal. Join us next time as we take a look at another crime from the annals of history. The story of Lizzie Borden and America's most famous axe murderer. And if you have a chance, hit the like button and follow on Spotify. And as always, if you like what you heard, tell a friend. And if you didn't, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.